The aim of this project is to really help these teachers to narrate their own experiences, their own struggles, their own successes, their own motivations for doing what they did.
Welcome to the Research and Reason podcast. Join us as we discuss the latest research, news and opinion from academics in the Faculty of Arts and Education at the University of Auckland.
Kia ora koutou katoa, ko Julianne Evans aho. My guest today is Dr. Ritesh Shah, whose expertise is in education in conflict and disaster zones, as well as the politics of foreign aid. Ritesh has spent time researching in some of the world's current hotspots, in Gaza, for example, in the West Bank, and the Donbass region of Ukraine. Ritesh is also the acting director of the Centre for Asia Pacific Refugee Studies, which is hosted here in the faculty. Tēnā koe, Ritesh. It's nice to have you here.
Tēnā koe, Julianne.
Perhaps we can start with the centre, because its core mission involves in addressing one of our hugest challenges, which is the forced displacement of people in the Asia and Pacific regions for various reasons. I'm assuming conflict, natural disasters, and increasingly climate change-related problems. It's a big mission. How does a centre like yours go about dealing with a problem like that? And what have been some of your wins?
That's a great question. Yes, forced displacement is, I would say, one of the wicked problems of our time. It's not a matter of just stopping people from moving. It's just not a matter of erecting wider fences or stronger policies to prevent movement, but it's also recognizing why movement is occurring and what are the kind of root causes of that. And those are really complicated. As you mentioned, they're wrapped up in issues around climate change. They're wrapped up in geopolitics. They're wrapped up in the kind of crumbling of our international world order as we're observing right now.
Oh, the wars we're having at the minute, for example?
The wars we're having. And in the end product is we're seeing the highest levels of forced displacement, both internal and outside of a country's borders since World War II at the moment.
Wow.
So in terms of what CAPRS tries to do then...
So CAPRS is the acronym.
Yes, CAPRS is the acronym. And not the caperberry, but...
No.
Yes.
The Centre for Asia Pacific Refugee Studies.
Yes. What we try to do is actually start from the local and expand outwards. And so a lot of our work in the last 5 years has really been looking at what is Aotearoa's role and positioning within this wider complexity of factors. A lot has been done within CAPRS to look at some of the bottlenecks and challenges that those who do arrive in Aotearoa face in terms of being able to successfully resettle, to successfully belong in the country. What are some of the kind of policy settings that might change that? So to give you just one example of this, 3 years ago, CAPRS, after having heard from and engaged with communities around Aotearoa, and specifically those who had arrived in New Zealand and then claimed asylum, it was very clear that there was an imbalance in the protections that were afforded to those who were claiming asylum, who are called convention refugees, and those who come in under our refugee quota. And the ones who arrive in New Zealand without having their protection status already having been granted oftentimes wait for very long periods of time. And while they are waiting for that decision and determination, in the past, they had no access to services, supports, entitlements in the same way that convention
Sometimes they were
refugees
put in prison, weren't they?
In a few cases, they were put in prison, and that has changed as a result of some positive legislative changes that have happened. But for the most part, they were in the community. But the problem is it's almost like being in a prison if you are in the community, but you have no right to work, no right to income, no right to education, limited access to healthcare. These were all huge inequities. And so CAPRS worked with the community and the wider sector and brought the evidence to bear on why this was such a big challenge. was able to successfully get government to make some changes to increase the supports and entitlements that are there for asylum seekers.
Yeah, which is a good win.
It's a great
Yeah,
win.
and it wasn't just a few people at the university. It was a wider group, wasn't it?
That's
That
100%.
involved people who came here as refugees themselves.
Yes, and that
Yeah.
is actually really core to what we do in CAPRS. Our aim is not to do work for communities, but to do work alongside communities. And our community are those who are forcibly displaced. And so a strong ethos for our work is what we call meaningful refugee participation. And that means not just kind of tokenistic, let's add a picture of a refugee here, or let's bring in a quote from a refugee or asylum seeker here, but how do we co-construct the whole process from thinking about what are the campaigns to voicing concerns to government to advocating. We're hoping to ensure that we are embodying those ideas of meaningful refugee participation. However, I will say it's an ongoing learning
It's
process.
a challenge at the moment, isn't it? Because we've got, at the moment, different ideas from this particular government about how that should work and possible changes to immigration as well.
Yes,
Yeah.
there are some really difficult challenges that are coming down the pike in terms of immigration reform. CAPRS recently, in response again to concerns that were coming from the sector, mobilized the kind of sector around forced displacement here in Aotearoa to think about how do we collectively respond to these changes to the protections that will be given to asylum seekers, and particularly around ensuring that due process is followed as part of that process of claiming asylum. And the current legislation aims to kind of remove many of those safeguards, many of those elements of due process. So
And kind of start off with a concept of suspicion, like you're here and we don't know about you,
Yeah.
rather than probably you're here for a good reason, and
Yeah.
hopefully we'll find out that's the case.
Yep.
Yeah.
And I will say that this is not a new phenomena here in
No.
Aotearoa. It's not a
Or in
new
the world.
or in the world.
Yeah.
In fact, I think that if we look back 20 years, only around 20% overall of all asylum claimants are granted their status here in
Wow.
Aotearoa. So 80% are rejected. And depending on which country you come from, those rates of acceptance can be quite a lot lower. So
Yeah.
places like India, for example, have very, very low rates of
Do they?
acceptance. Yes.
Hmm.
Yeah.
It's interesting because they also have quite high rates of asylum seeking
Yes.
once they are here. Is that right?
There are higher rates, but we
Mm.
also have to think about what are the raw numbers, right?
Yeah.
So if we think about who are our biggest immigrant groups or migrant groups to New Zealand, Indians are in the top 3.
Mhm.
So I don't think it's a
It's just it's a numbers game.
it's a numbers
Mhm.
game, and at the same time, there is and this is a kind of wider set of issues that CAPRS has been kind of wrestling with and thinking about is what is it that's kind of problematic about the whole protection regime in general. And while the protection regime is supposed to be neutral, it's supposed to be focused on addressing the most vulnerable and the greatest needs. In the end of the day, all governments that are making decisions around whether to grant protection or not are doing so in their own national interest.
Mm.
And in the case of India, for instance, this is what wrapped up in New Zealand's diplomatic ties with India, its desire to
Free trade
increase,
agreement.
free
Mhm.
trade agreement, strengthen economic linkages, which means that you don't want to then be calling out a government that you're trying to create such partnerships with as potentially committing human rights abuses.
Yeah.
And but we do know that, for instance, that is the case in India, particularly if you're of a lower caste, if you're of a minority religion, even depending on whether you're an indigenous Adivasi Indian versus, someone who is considered Indian by citizenship. So there are all sorts of challenges and complexities in India.
Yeah. And some of those people are likely to come here and say, I don't want to go back.
Yep, 100%.
Because of all those reasons.
Yep.
Yeah.
And our approach is to treat all of those things with suspicion because in the end, this isn't just about looking at the person, but it's looking about that person in New Zealand's wider
Yeah.
geopolitical context.
And I'm aware as well that the centre is doing a lot of work to support new and emerging scholars, and you have a lot of fellows connected to the centre that are in some of these countries that are experiencing some of these problems firsthand.
That's right, Julianne.
Mm.
And thankfully, you've been one of the individuals that's been supporting some of those fellows. But what I wanted to say is that that is a really important aspect of what CAPRS does as well, is that we are trying to amplify and strengthen the voices of refugee leaders and scholars.
In their own countries
In
as
their
well as
own
here.
countries,
Mm.
but also those that are based here in Aotearoa. So I'll just give you two quick examples of that. So one is that we run the non-residential fellowship program, which you've just mentioned, where we work with students with lived experience, ideally, who are based in countries either of transit or in their original home countries, where they are working to try to change some of the issues that they've identified around the forced migration regime. So we've had fellows based in India, in Thailand, who are Myanmar nationals. We currently have an Afghani fellow who's based in India. We've had fellows based in Australia, and they're all doing really incredible work, whether it's engaging with communities around some of their research, to policymakers, to UN bodies, to the public, in terms of trying to change some of the ideas and logics that sit behind forced displacement. The other thing quickly that I'll mention is in Aotearoa, we are the secretariat for a group called the New Zealand Refugee Advisory Panel. Now, this is a group of refugee leaders who have been identified and selected jointly by our centre and Immigration New Zealand. And their role is to work directly with government and advise them on policy related to refugees and asylum seekers. And our job is to really support how they engage
How
with
they do that.
government, how they
And do they
communicate.
have some real power, do you think?
I think they do. I think they're the associate minister, senior officials in Immigration New Zealand. They will go to this group regularly to seek advice, to seek inputs. That doesn't mean that they always listen to that group, but we're helping them to figure out what's the best way to engage with ministers, with senior officials, to get their perspectives and voices heard.
And which brings me to think that you have also personally been very fortunate lately with two different grants from the same organisation, the Spencer Foundation, and they are connected directly to the areas that you care about and you know about, education in conflict and disaster zones, and also the politics of foreign aid. Can you quickly run through what those are? Because I think they're pretty interesting.
Sure. Yes, I am very fortunate, especially in the constrained funding environment we find ourselves in now in our disciplines. But the first one is really looking at what's happening in Gaza right now in terms of education. And my focus and interest there is actually the work of teachers, as what I call the kind of frontline actors, who are dealing with the ongoing challenges of living through genocide. And so the aim of this piece of research is actually just to make visible
Their efforts.
their efforts, because unfortunately, if you were to open up mainstream media, look in research, you won't find anything about that. And there is a real concern that when and if Gaza's reconstruction happens, those efforts will be erased from the historical memory. So the aim of this project is to really help these teachers to narrate their own experiences, their own struggles, their own successes, their own motivations for doing what they did.
And the fact that they're still there, in fact, I was just looking at something recently that said, tents are back up again, people are learning again, children are still going somehow, some way, still, despite everything,
Yes.
and still probably, having bombs come down upon them quite often. They're
Yes.
still doing it, aren't they? Right
Yeah.
now, as we speak, in
Right now,
in May 2026.
And in fact, we've done some of the piloting now of the survey that we're conducting, and some of the responses we've received back are examples of teachers having started these kinds of initiatives within a month of October 7th. So these efforts are not
And that's
new.
2023
And
you're
that was
talking
in
about.
2023. And the way that these teachers and these students have kind of continued to show up, despite, being relocated 6, 7 times, despite
Losing
having
family members.
losing, I
Mm.
mean, there was a story from one teacher of a girl who lost her entire family and still managed to show up to these learning centers and the way the teacher described it is it's this child's one source of hope left is to come to the learning center to see that there is a future beyond the present.
And who is teaching? Who are the teachers?
Some are teachers who were teachers before
Yeah.
October 7th, 2023. A lot of them, though, are volunteers. A lot of them are just mums, dads, members of the community who feel a responsibility to do something and recognize that, especially for society in Gaza, education is the one source of hope and future. And that while in the present things look really bad, that in the future things will hopefully look better. And it's to the future generation that
And they want to
must.
be prepared.
Yep.
Yeah. And because you yourself have spent time there, haven't you?
Yes. Yeah.
How recently were you there?
The last time I was there was 2022. So it was about 4 years ago now. And that was after the pandemic. It was after there had been some escalations in 2021 and 2020. And interestingly enough, I was involved in another piece of research there, which even at that time was really showing some alarming trends with children's well-being there, where only 1 in 10 of them felt hope for the future.
Yeah.
And it makes me really concerned about what the situation is now. But yet, when I read and listen to these narratives from teachers from Gaza who have shown up in droves to give these kind of testimonials, because for them they also recognize the importance of giving this kind of historical record. It really is inspiring. And one teacher even said something like, "We're a role model to educators around the world around what you can do with
Under the
very
most
little."
distressing conditions.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because that then, thinking about the other grant, it's slightly connected, really, isn't it? Because it's about in a kind of wider, bigger picture.
Yeah.
Because it's all about zooming back away from something like Gaza, but going the way we fund these education programs in these conflict zones is all wrong.
Yep.
Essentially, and needs to be entirely reimagined. That's the other grant, and that seems to involve lots of different people from all over the world.
It does.
And including you, by the sounds of it.
Yes, it
Yeah.
does.
So what's that about?
Okay, well, let me connect it actually directly to
Yeah.
Gaza and my own personal experience. So I started going to Gaza in 2011, and one of my roles was to look at programming that was set up after every conflict to support children's resilience, to make them bounce back and to kind of just forget about the past and just move on.
Mm-hmm.
And the first couple times I went there, I thought, okay, these programs are a good thing. They're really helping the children. And then by the third or fourth time, and the fact that these conflicts were cyclical, and the fact that these were being funded by international donors from governments that were the same governments supplying arms to the
Mm-hmm.
aggressor of that conflict, raised some real challenges for me. And I thought, what's really going on here? What's the kind of intention and aim of these kinds of programs? Why is it that there is so much focus on this? And it was actually from those questions that I started to ask and write about in 2016 that led me to kind of keep expanding my lens outwards. And through other engagements I had in places like Ukraine, and thinking about how the Ukraine response was so different in terms of what was...
Was it?
100%. I mean, just in terms of the resources, in
Oh,
terms
yeah.
of the way
Oh, that's right,
countries
yeah.
kind of open their doors,
Yeah.
in terms of even the aid money and how it all of a sudden just disappeared out of all these other conflict-affected contexts and flowed into Ukraine. It raised for me this bigger question of, is the humanitarian system really set up to help those most in need, or is it there to kind of protect our own interest? And increasingly, I came to see that it was the latter. And given that I was quite critical of this architecture and this system, and recognizing that increasingly the humanitarian architecture, despite this kind of benevolent, kind of outward characteristic, that we're here to really help
Mm.
those that are
And this
in.
is beyond just feeding people day to day,
This
isn't
is,
it?
yeah.
This is something else.
This is,
Yeah.
I mean, but it's all
Because,
aspects of humanitarian
yeah.
aid, right? So it's not just in education; it's across the entire humanitarian sector. I realize that so much of this kind of current structure of humanitarianism is still wrapped up in the same logics that were there during times of colonization. The white savior complex, this idea that we can somehow
Come in from outside.
come in from outside, help, that we know best, that we have the solutions, that we have the best logic of intervention, and that nothing was happening before, or nothing has been happening in the absence of someone coming in and
Mm.
helping from the outside. And all of this I could see, present in the education in conflict community.
Like a microcosm of it.
It was
Yeah.
a microcosm, and
Yeah.
in fact, I think there was more recalcitrance to change in that particular community, because I would say that it was a relatively new sector, and so much time and effort had been put to just getting enough funding
Yeah.
that they didn't want to actually think about how the funding was being
No.
used. But, in 2020, 21, I started to have conversations with the biggest umbrella network in the world, which is called the Interagency Network of Education and Emergencies. They have members in 193
Mhm.
countries, about 30,000 members now, a range of different stakeholders. And they too were starting to kind of ask some of these questions. And so that continued, and I started to write about this. I engaged with other practitioners and scholars who were
Who'd
also thinking
also
about that,
noticed this?
who were
Yeah.
also noticing. We wrote a piece where we actually engaged in a conversation between us and
Mhm.
talked about this, and the manifestation of it was this Spencer Grant. And the Spencer Grant's idea is to build a collective vision,
A new way.
a new way. What would that look like? And what we're hoping to do is to do this from the bottom up. So we're going to actually start by engaging with conflict affected communities and take those visions upwards, and also highlight where there are contradictions and tensions in the different visions that are raised.
Wow. And support the vision of those local people, basically, as much
Ideally,
as possible.
yeah, as much as
Yeah.
possible. But we also want to make clear that we have to acknowledge, where does the current power sit?
Yeah.
Where do the current
Where's the money?
resources sit? Yeah, all of those things. And how do we start to change it? So it's actually first to make those tensions visible rather than kind of flattening them out, and then think about, okay, how do we move beyond that?
It's a huge job, isn't it? Don't you think?
It does
Are
feel
you
like
mad?
a huge, well, it's a huge job, but I will say we're very fortunate to have the partnership of the Interagency Network of Education and Emergencies. They're very much on board with this. They're very much a partner in this.
So they see the problem, because that's
Oh,
interesting that they do.
they
Yeah.
do. They
Yeah.
do. And the leadership of it sees the problem. Members see the problem. I think it's been made even more visible by the kind of collapse of many of the big funders. So yes, the
Yeah.
US is the most visible one, but in fact, most of the European donors have also reduced humanitarian funding by 25 to 50%.
Wow.
Canada has also reduced its funding. So there's a real crisis moment where there's this recognition that things can't continue the way they were.
Because it's too fragile for those people to rely on
Yeah.
the benevolence of those bigger powers.
Yep. Yeah. Too fragile,
Yeah.
and too wrapped up in, I think, what's increasingly visible as well, from the last probably 14 to 18 months, is that all of this aid is conditional.
Yes.
It's tied up in whether or not you agree to a particular deal, whether or not you agree to particular other terms.
If you see the world in the same way or
Yep.
not.
Yep.
Yeah.
And
So-
so it's become, I think, what's of all the challenges and issues we've seen, particularly with the current U.S. presidency, I think what it does lay bare is actually how these issues are quite visible now.
And
In
how
a way,
broken it all is.
and how broken it all is.
Yeah.
And in a way, I think we need that to be able to start to reimagine something different.
So something good might come out of all of this.
That's my hope.
Yeah.
That is my hope, and that's what keeps me kind of moving forward at this time, because I think it's really easy to feel despondent.
Very much so.
To feel that everything around us as we know it is kind of crumbling. But I actually think we are at the point in our society where we need things to be able to crumble a bit to begin to reimagine things anew.
Just playing devil's advocate before we finish. One thing I think people might be thinking is these are all very well, these ideas, and they do probably all need to change. But meanwhile, people still have to be fed. They still have to go to school in some way. They still have to have some basic needs met. Are we risking, the complete disintegration of everything before you rebuild it? Or how could you approach that with this new idea?
I think we can't immediately go to just seeing the entire architecture crumble and with nothing to replace it. So I take solace in this idea of what Vanessa Andreotti calls hospicing. And I think what we need to do is hospice this current system to see it die its slow death. And while that's happening, to be actively thinking about a rebuilding process. Having said that, I also think that there are some easy, quick things that could happen right now. Things like looking at where money is going in terms of military spending versus spending to education or
hospitals.
health. To give you a quick example, in education, just 6 days of the money that goes to funding military expenditure could actually help get 250 million children who are out of school into school. So 6 days of
Is this for the whole world
for the global military spending. So it just shows you it's about our current priorities and what we value and what we're demanding for and what we're holding our governments accountable to. But in the long term, it's also about thinking about mechanisms of redistribution of wealth. It's about thinking about, what is it that's enabled countries like Aotearoa to be where it is now, and what is our responsibility as a member of the global community to the entire world. And those are difficult challenges.
Those are huge challenges, and I think especially, when we're seeing marches in the UK like we did just recently in London, 2 different marches, one about 2 very different ways of looking at the world. One saying, immigrants are a problem, we don't want them here, we don't like them here, we particularly don't like certain kinds of people here, and the other saying, but, they're the human race, and they're struggling and suffering. Do we not have a responsibility to them? 2 very different visions. We're just hoping that the side of light is going to win, aren't we?
We do, but I think in the end, we have to recognize that we're actually all tied and connected to each other. So we can't shut our door and think that the problem's going to go away. And whether that's climate change, whether that's forced displacement, whether that's the war happening in Iran right now, these things are not outside of our borders. Whether we choose to imagine that or not, it's actually all of our collective responsibility. And that's the thing that I think, again, is what I hold on to in my work.
I think it's good to hold on to that.
Yes.
And good way to finish. Thank you, Ritesh. Thank you very much.
You're
Nai mihi
welcome.
nui.
Yeah. Thank you, Julianne.
You've been listening to the Research and Reason podcast. Stay up to date with the Faculty of Arts and Education by following us on social media.